And he's come up with a list of why this stuff's difficult. The scales are highly variable from the molecular up to the global in spatial terms, but also in temporal terms. We are confronting the possibility of absolute ecological limits. Concepts like extinction, I think it's best that we, despite what the gene jockeys say, I think we should retain the notion that extinction is forever. Many of the policy impacts are irreversible, and yet they're urgent. Yet everything seems to be connected to everything else. It's often characterised by a degree of technical uncertainty and ambiguity. If you take issues like land clearing and say salinity or water quality, many of the impacts are cumulative rather than discrete. You can clear a hectare of bush over here and it doesn't look too bad. You do that for 100 years across vast landscapes and suddenly you've changed the rainfall, as we're seeing now in Queensland. The issues are value-laden and have very strong moral dimensions and new moral dimensions. Many of the problem causes are systemic, and yet even the experts argue about the most appropriate methods and instruments for dealing with them. The property rights around things like carbon or genes are ill-defined, even water are ill-defined, and the responsibilities that attach to those property rights are even worse, even less well-defined. And to make it all worse, the damn community expects to be involved. So as if this isn't tricky enough technically, the everyday citizen thinks that they've got a say. That gives rise to a huge policy agenda. One of the things that people most want to see is some leadership to set direction in where we're going as a country and as a globe. One of the interesting things about the climate change phenomenon, and the Climate Institute will be putting out their latest polling in the next couple of days, but that polling, which has been done in the last week or so, using the conventional national samples, same as the electoral polls, shows that even now the community is way out ahead of the government on climate change. They found the latest data is that less than 7% of the Australian community think we shouldn't have signed Kyoto. So you're down in Brendan Nelson territory there. And it's really important that we find ways of helping our leaders to actually lead. The community's been well ahead of government on climate change for a long time. And there's a strong expectation of actual leadership. We also need to, because of that issue of the sort of thinking that got us to where we are now is not going to get us out of it, we actually need to foster innovation. We need radically new options. Sorry about the shadows there. We need user-friendly metrics for carbon and water and energy. We need signals getting back to consumers in a smarter way, through markets and other ways. In Australia, we don't have a strong tradition of regulation of environmental behaviour. We're quite good at drafting pretty good legislation, but we're very poor at implementing it. So if you look at, say, soil conservation legislation or tree clearing legislation or whatever, the legislation, when you read it's not too bad. And then you look and see how many prosecutions were there last year. Usually, you can count them on the figures of one hand.
Doesn't that suggest that legislation is not very good? It can't be enforced?
No, well, you could say the legislation's out of kilter with our culture of private property rights, the sanctity of private property rights, and also over a vast area, so it's very expensive to do enforcement and compliance. But basically, it often comes down to political will. And again, the community often has a view that they'd like to see a lot more compliance than has been forced. we've got a big job to do to sort out the planning hierarchy, particularly within our federal system. Take something really simple like sea level rise, and look at the ecological functioning of estuaries. Estuaries are going to move upstream. Mangroves need to be able to move upstream. Levee banks are going to have to move upstream. Approving coastal development, therefore, should be something that we go back to the drawing board on. But that would require local government, catchment management authorities, state governments and federal government actually getting their act together about new planning schemes. It would require some transparency about, I have not yet seen serious maps of Australia showing what's going to happen under different climate change scenarios. I would not be investing in units on the Gold Coast if I was you. But it's really important we start informing the market about that. But it's at the moment in the too hard basket. So that's what I mean about whole of governments and all governments' approaches to climate, water and energy interactions. We have to have a clean sheet approach to Australian infrastructure across transport, housing, architecture, obviously energy production, and clearly water. We need governments to set minimum standards, and in terms of influencing behaviour, in crude terms, we need both juicier carrots and smarter sticks. We're hopeless at measuring our long-term impact, and I think we do need to put in place something like the Americans, the Canadians and the British are all doing. The best, well, the biggest example is the American National Ecological Observatory Network, which is a typical American shock and awe sort of approach that divided the continent up into 21 domains. Each domain has a mega site with 1,000 different sensors measuring 1,600 different variables, and they're all joined together through a supercomputer, and NASA has 2 planes in the air at all times, and then they have truck-mounted systems that they can take to a weed invasion front or a wildfire situation. But nevertheless, that system is set up to give hard data about the rate of environmental change across about half a dozen key parameters. In Australia, each state does its own thing. The data management is hopeless. We don't have any seriously well-run long-term ecological monitoring sites. And for many of our key parameters, we can't tell whether they're going forwards or backwards at the crudest level. The data systems are not well joined up. So we have an ignorance-based system. And we have to bring the community along. Okay, so that's a very quick introduction. Now I'm going to give you a very quick National Geographic sort of biophysical context for managing natural resources in Australia. I like to think of us as a small young nation in a vast old continent. We have unique biological and cultural richness in a highly variable climate. The community is largely on site, but we're spread extremely thin. Very few people, and the size of our economy compared to the size of the continent is very, very small. Yet we're able to invent new institutions and close down old ones and change them much more easily than older countries. Not older geologically, but older politically and economically and socially. And we do have an open economy, which is a big advantage. We have sufficient know-how to make progress. We have some of the world's best landscape ecologists, for example. As I mentioned, we're on a journey that we'll be on for a long time. This old continent has 7 to 10% of all the world's species. It's been drifting on its own for about 400 million years, and it has some of the oldest living life forms, a very large coastline and a large fishing zone. Because it's old and flat and poorly drained, it's the driest inhabited continent. It's incredibly geologically stable. There's not much of it that is high.